visioning session. It's nice to see you all here again. I think some people may be trickling in the next few minutes, since we did change our start time to 6:30 today. So just a reminder that if you're not the one speaking, please mute your microphones so that we have. I think some people may be trickling in the next few minutes, since we did change our start time to 6:30 today. So just a reminder that if you're not the one speaking, please mute your microphones so that we have. Sam, can you fix this? Be trickling in the next few minutes, since we did change our start time to 6:30 today. So just a reminder.
Tom, you have the YouTube running in the background.
Your phone so that we have. Okay, thank you. And that's why we mute our microphones. Where was I? So I thank you all for joining. We have a special guest tonight, Don Elliott, and he will be formally introduced, I think, when we get to his part of the presentation, but it should provide for some informative and interesting discussion. And on that note, I will hand things off to our consultant team.
Great, thank you, Kristen. So just as a reminder for the folks that are watching us on live stream, we'll introduce our team and our guest this evening. So I'm Tom McGilloway with Mahan Reichel. Steve
Kellenberg with Kellenberg Studio.
Uri,
you're muted.
Uri Avon with the University of Maryland Center for Smart Growth.
and Ann.
I'm Ann Forsyth. I'm a faculty member in urban planning and a fan of Columbia's.
And then Don, do you want to introduce yourself? Don will be speaking later on about 7:15.
Sure. I'm Don Elliott. I'm with director with Clarion Associates based in Denver, Colorado, and I led the project to do the zoning assessment for Howard County several years ago.
Great. Well, thank you. We're happy to have you here, Don, and appreciate your time. Next slide, Steve. We are on workshop 6, which is a continuation of the synthesis phase. So we'll continue on our discussion of draft policies and frameworks. Tonight we'll be focusing on redevelopment and governance. We're going to go through each of those. We'll hit redevelopment, maybe the next slide, the agenda. So we'll hit redevelopment. We'll have a little bit of discussion on that. Steve will then cover governance. And depending on how much time we have, we may save that discussion until after Don speaks. Don will be with us until 8 o'clock. So he has a presentation, and then we'll have some discussion with that. And then we'll continue our discussion after his conversation and wrap with next steps. Yes. So I believe you all got the notes from the last workshop. Just not to dwell on these in too much detail, but we had several themes that came through. It was great discussion. This was the first discussion where we talked about draft policies. And I think a really good point that came out of this, and we'll be getting into this in the next steps, was the need for some meta policies in the vision and looking at holistically as well as the individual components. There was a lot of discussion on the diversity and distribution of affordable housing and how that's distributed throughout the county and whether it makes sense in Western County. There was a little bit of disagreement on that, but we've established there are many areas outside of Columbia that aren't located in the West that might be appropriate for that. Open space, a lot of discussion on that. And especially that it's meaningful and as part of an overall connected system. And then there was some conversation on considering fee in lieu for open space, but not getting hung up on maybe some of the shortcomings of how fee in lieu worked in the past on some things. And so looking at how can we make it more effective. Civic engagement, a lot of discussion on that, especially that it includes more than just the cultural engagement, but political engagement as well. Housing, we had a bit of discussion on that, talking about, how do we incorporate some new housing, especially, if we look at ADUs, what's the impact on the character of Columbia, the potential and concern that's some potential resistance to changes in the single family neighborhoods. Several points made that, housing really needs to be hand in hand with the schools discussions. And then looking at decentralizing affordable housing, but not necessarily doing it all outside of Columbia, but still looking at how can we still do it within Columbia. And then lastly, on transportation, again, we had some discussion on the path usage and how much they're used. Talked a lot about the interlocking equation between traffic and mixed use, that there are ways to kind of positively impact traffic when tied with mixed use and development, especially in a walkable format. And then talking lastly on, focusing on not so much no traffic impacts, but how can we have the least amount of traffic impacts when we look at meeting both social goals and transportation goals. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Steve if you want to get started here.
Sure, thanks, Tom. We're gonna continue on kind of the same rhythm that we had on our last meeting. We covered, quite a few topics last time, and we had two kind of left over that we're going to finish on this evening. One being redevelopment, and the other being sort of governance. And we've kind of left the best for last, which is governance, and that's when we've got Don here to help us sort of navigate through that particular topic during this session. So we're kind of excited about that. I want to give you a little bit of foreshadowing here in that what to expect after tonight. And that is, we're putting together the responses and the discussion that we have on these different sort of candidate policies. And we're revising the policies, we're kind of reorganizing them. And we're going to get those back out to you fairly quickly, like within a week or so. And so that we have a fairly good period of time for you all to digest them. And this will be policies, candidate policies for all the topics, for you all to review them, digest them, mark them up. We're going to give them to you in a workable Word document so you can go at it. And then for our final meeting, we will have all of your responses to those candidate policies already adjusted and refined for sort of a draft of the package. So quite a bit going on after this meeting, and an opportunity for you all to be very engaged in the next level of policy definition. So let's jump into it. Redevelopment is one of our favorite topics. It's where a lot of different things come together. We've already talked about housing, but here we'll continue to talk about it, and along with retail and so what we're going to be doing is again, if you remember, it seems a long time ago, we did this survey, but it kind of it was very helpful in helping us sort of focus down on where we are, where our thoughts are on some of these topics. So we're going to go through these results. This was, basically addresses the village centers and sort of how to tackle those. We know they're a subject of change and evolution in the community. And our survey sort of built up to number 3 and where we see number 3 and number 5 here. That basically two things. One is that I think there's pretty strong, consensus that we need to continue to redevelop and look at these village centers. However, the approval process that we've been using is, time consuming and dense, and there needs to be some rethinking about what that approval process is so we can actually be more productive and move this process along. So that led to draft policy R1, which basically says we need to better facilitate the redevelopment of the village centers with new village center focus area plans, developed with professional assistance and in collaboration with the county. There were village center planning that has been done. There were master plans done for most of the village centers, but those need to be dusted off, relooked at with some assistance, and then in cooperation with the county. And it's not just about housing and retail, but there needs to be a wide variety of uses that are looked at. And then this is a pretty strong statement. For this process to be effective, we need to completely revamp the approval process and identify incentives to draw developers' interests, such as density bonus and exclusion from affordable housing requirements and others to be determined. So this is sort of fodder for what Don's going to talk about a little bit later about how do we do that. So anyway, that's the first policy. The second redevelopment question had to do again with village centers and some concern about them affecting, if not redeveloped properly, the fact that we do have a unique character in Columbia. That's a theme that has continued to bubble up. And so this idea of identifying key signature elements, what makes Columbia unique, understanding those and building those into a set of guidelines so that as the redevelopment opportunities come up, they can be developed. There's something that can guide that redevelopment and design. And then that process needs to be integrated into the general plan update, and that there's a more master housing distribution sort of plan for where housing goes relative to those village centers and others. So the policy that kind of resulted from that is that redevelopment would be more acceptable if it did incorporate key signature elements that reflect Columbia's character. These need to be defined and provide the core content for a new set of guidelines. And the process should be tackled sooner rather than later. And in addition to that, the general plan update should be seen as a vehicle for putting forth a housing distribution plan that helps inform those village center guidelines and master plans. The third question was, talks about our sort of Gateway, Dobbin Road, Snowden River Parkway, our commercial corridors, and the opportunity that has come up. We've acknowledged that those are opportunities for redevelopment, and there seems to be a pretty strong response here about these should play a significant role in addressing housing and retail and other uses. I think we say elsewhere that they should not be all about housing. They need to be multi-use. And that we should take a pretty strong position in the general plan update regarding these. So the policy here is pretty straightforward, that there really is, as we do develop sort of a larger sort of Columbia vision plan for housing as part of the general plan update, that these are identified and that there's their role in establishing sort of an ultimate Columbia vision is identified and defined in that in that process. The next question had to do with retail, and there was a pretty strong support that the Wildlife Village Center, as an example of sort of market-driven repositioning, is a reasonable example. Where retail is repositioned, it might be downsized, it might be replaced with the types of retail that are most appropriate. Although it was very clear here that all these village centers are different. There isn't a single solution set for them. Each one has its own retail opportunities, its own sort of opportunities for redevelopment, and that so that uniqueness needs to be acknowledged. And then there's some support here for a master retail strategy that kind of says like, okay, here we are in 2020. Everything, the retail context has changed. Should we just take a comprehensive look rather than piecemealing retail, village by village? And so we've the policy that sort of results from that, again, is acknowledging Lake Village Center, I think one of the comments that was made was, well, if Lake Village Center is so great, why is there why are there empty storefronts there? That's a good question, but probably is supportive of this notion of a master retail strategy that responds to real market forces so that retail can be sized appropriately. That this process would incorporate not only CA, but the village boards, of course, as their village centers. And that we should consider a comprehensive retail study and strategy that looks at market forces, what's going on outside Columbia, and what is realistic for retail in the near and midterm within Columbia. And then we sort of jump to this topic of sort of other parcels. There's a lot of, if you remember the power in the PowerPoint that we presented and the appendix we provided you, there were maps that showed a lot of older part and smaller projects that were over 40 years old that were probably pretty ripe for redevelopment. And so there was quite a bit of support for inventorying those, working with the county to develop a program, a campaign for how those could be redeveloped in an orderly manner. But along the lines, though, of consistency with Columbia community character. And then there was some also support for the county to try and acquire some of these and put them into kind of redevelopment mode sooner rather than later. And the policy that resulted from that was requesting the county to develop a policy encouraging and supporting redevelopment to these parcels for market rate and mixed income housing to assist in expanding the community's attainable housing stock. Now, this one, goes hand in hand with when we were back talking about housing policy. One of the policies was working over the next, over the midterm, over the next decade, to try and decentralize affordable housing out of some of the villages of Columbia and get a more distributed pattern of affordable housing, both within Columbia and also in the county at large. And so the idea would be that these smaller, older parcels outside the villages could play a role in that decentralization and better distribution. But we want to cast a net over these outside parcels so that as they redevelop, they are consistent with Columbia character and feel like they're part of the community and not fighting against it in terms of aesthetics, and then again work with the county on trying to get a little redevelopment action going on some of these. So those are the draft policies. You can see they cover a number of topics. So at this point, I think we'll open it up for discussion and response, so we can help us refine these, so we can get these back to you in a refined iteration.
Yeah, so in the list, so Bryn and Sherry had a comment, I think it was on the first policy, Steve. There's a question about where did the last bullet come from? Ori had answered it was one of the survey respondents. So a lot of survey respondents have written in some comments as well. But did you want to, Bryn or Sherry, elaborate on your question at all? Or
well, this is Bryn. When I read the page prior to this one, I just didn't see I didn't see how we got from the one to the, from
well, I
one
guess
page
it was
to the
that
next.
number 5, where there's 5 responses to the purple, one. I mean, it's I think that third one is pretty much a, pretty
I guess
much
what
similar to that one.
Yeah, yes, I can see that now. Sorry, it was going so fast. But I guess what I'm still struggling with is, to me, if you go back again,
Sure.
the one that has 4 seems to me to be polar opposite to the one that has 5. Maybe not polar opposite, but they seem to be counter to each other. And so, and there's only one vote difference between the two. I was trying to come to
Well,
terms.
I think how I looked at these, and not that it's the right way, but if you notice sort of the third, the fourth, and the fifth one are building on each other. So the third is, that most of the village centers are in need of active intervention. We need to change attitude and be more open-minded, streamline the approval process. And then 3 says, well, we agree with that one, but we need to accelerate even more. And 5 builds on those 2. So I kind of add those up. See, I see those as being 9 votes for kind of an accelerated, approach versus, like you said, the 4. So rightly or wrongly, that's how I kind of processed the,
Okay, thank you.
If I can comment
Yes,
on,
please.
I think I agree with Bryn that I did not see 5 as being predominant. And I think to say that to accelerate redevelopment with professional assistance does not say the same thing as the proposed policy statement. Professional assistance may bring about new housing types, may bring about entirely different ways of approaching full spectrum housing. And collaborating with the county is certainly is obviously the way that it would need to come about, but that implies that there would be a public process, there would be public input, and nobody mentioned incentives, density bonuses, exclusion from affordable housing. I think goes to the exact opposite of what we've been talking about. Standards being lowered is the way some communities have gone. I've not heard anyone on the board suggest that we would like to see a loosening of standards or a different kind of approach to quality. So I think that last statement is problematic.
Okay. Other thoughts? I'm not finding reducing standards in here, so I'm not sure where you're getting that inference. Perhaps you believe that incentives sort of correlate with reducing standards, maybe, or maybe exclusion from affordable housing requirements. You see that as reducing standards?
Yeah, or there's been talk about difference in parking, in difference in terms of other kinds of requirements in terms of setbacks, differences in requirements, for example, maybe for open space or amenities. So all of these have to do with quality of life types of issues.
Okay.
When you say there's been
one of the themes that we had in here, and maybe it was after this particular one, was this notion of identifying what are the signature elements and what is the character of Columbia, and making sure that and if there are new developments, guidelines, or standards, making sure that those embrace and codify those those signature elements. So in my mind, that is part of this process. That it isn't actually lowering the standards; it's clarifying the standards, perhaps, to where they lead us to a Columbia, a reinforcement of Columbia character.
I think that's a very good point. There are aspects of design, for example, that are characteristic of the unique character of Columbia. We've just been talking about this in terms of the park in Columbia. What I really like is the statement that says the studies need to look at a wide array of uses, not just housing and retail. I think we could probably approach this in a creative way to see what else can be done in terms of, for example, clustered housing for arts or for performance or for, I mean, there are lots of interesting things that some other communities have been doing to create art and music spaces that combine housing, retail, and studios, for example. I just passed a place, I was down in Northern Virginia, and I saw exactly that kind of thing, a redevelopment of a factory type of area that combined all three. So that's an interesting way of looking at things, and a little bit different from what we've heard so far.
Well, I think what you're suggesting is, what is the definition of a village center? I mean, it can be a lot of different things. And if its role as a center of retail is diminishing for all the reasons that we've discussed, especially in some of the centers, then why not have it ramp up its role in terms of civic engagement and cultural facilities? And of course, we have to figure out how that gets paid for. But, and it could be funded in part by redevelopment activities. If there is some housing that comes in, maybe part of that, there's some investment in cultural and civic infrastructure, in that village center as part of a, housing, entitlement, approval. But yeah, so I think that's a very good point. What is a village center? It can be a lot of different things. And I say that in here, that each of these village centers is going to have its own solution set, and its own program evolving forward. I think that this last topic, this last bullet, which seems to be a little bit controversial, is I would take out of it, any implication for reducing, standards. But, I guess it's kind of comes from, if there seems to be a fairly robust here, if we look at number 3, 4, and 5 of, do we want to take it 20 years or 30 years to, revamp the remaining village centers, or do we want to try and do it in the next decade? Then how do you move forward with it at a little bit faster pace? And I'm sensing some energy between wanting to move it forward a little bit sooner. Let's get it over with. Let's get it going. Let's turn these around and make them more interesting and exciting. And with the civic and cultural and repositioning retail and some cool housing for young families that maybe has housing types that are different from what we have in Columbia. Well, how do we do that? How do you accelerate it? And so that's where I think this idea of incentives, it kind of comes forward. How do you make them more attractive, to the marketplace? And of course, one of the ways of doing that is density, which is a 4-letter word, but maybe there's a tweener on density that says it's maybe a little bit more dense than what's out there now, but it isn't overwhelming. It isn't super, it doesn't break, it's not in contrast again to the Columbia character. Instead of going to 5 or 6 stories, it goes to 3 or 4 stories, and there's the right architectural style and materials and colors. But that's where the incentive idea comes from, is how do we just move this along a little bit?
All right, it's about 7:05 and want to make sure we get a couple more comments in before Don talks. But Dick, you were next. You had a comment about Columbia proper, and then later on also about obstacles to good planning. So do you want to?
Yes, you mentioned 3 areas and said they weren't Columbia proper. They are Columbia, and they are part of Columbia. And these are areas, well, Gateway is kind of up in the air. We don't know what's going to happen there. But Stone River Parkway is Columbia, and it's being spoiled. We're seeing strip malls, we're seeing gas stations, we're seeing a tendency to take it toward Route 40. And that's a problem, because it's really being ignored. But my other comment was, as we look at things that we set up as what we're looking for, we should look at also why some of these things aren't happening. And there are, we talk about incentives, which makes me nervous because whenever you give developers an incentive, that's put off in a shortcut. And maybe we should be looking at disincentives. But there are several factors here that really affect any plan we put together. And as we come up with recommendations, we really need to address some of these problems. And one of them here is, of course, the school system. The school system drives, the school districting drives property values. And we have little control over that. And we've just elected a school board that doesn't want to address the problem of school districts. We have developer influence. I've been in a recent scuffle in my village with a program that has a great deal of community opposition, which seems to just keep going forward. And as I looked at the developer, I noticed that he, in the past 2 years, has contributed $5,000 to members of our county council. And I'm sure they're not influenced by that at all, but 3,000 went to our county exec and 1,000 each to a couple of council members. That's a problem. That's a big problem. And we're seeing that problem on Snowden River, where a program just went ahead that should not have gone ahead, but seemed to have a lot of politician push on it. One of the problems that we in the Columbia Association have to address is we have a lot of people who don't really understand Columbia. They came here for the schools and they don't understand the route's vision. They're not involved, and we at CA have to really address that and try to get people on, help them understand the history and the traditions of the community. Another big problem, which has really hurt our village centers, is the big box stores. And I love the big box stores. I was just in Costco yesterday, but I know what that does to my local giant. And so the big box stores are a factor, and we're not going to make them all go away. And so when we look at these village centers that are based around having a supermarket or some other main attraction, we're going to have to find another way to revitalize them in regard to that. And the other big problem is out parcels. We have Newtown zoning, which is spotty. And where Rouse was able to buy big hunks of land, it's beautiful. And then you come across something that's just ugly and inappropriate. And there's nothing we seem to be able to do about that. So I don't have any necessary answers, but I think as we look at what we want to do, we have to look at these problems and figure how can we steer our way around them.
All right. Thank you, Dick. I want to, before we have 5 minutes, Paul, you've been waiting. Maybe Paul will be the last one, then Don will turn it over to you.
Am I up?
You're up.
This is Paul.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to bring up a couple of items. One is I'm on the Public Advisory Committee for AHOCO by Design, as is Kristen, as is Sherry. And the guidelines that were adopted by the County Council for the updated general plan, I believe specifically exclude the village centers as well as the downtown as part of this general plan update. If I'm incorrect, please tell me so. Having said that, I want to speak to your R1 policy, where you're talking about better facilitate redevelopment. I don't know what that means. What I do know is that in Oakland Mills, we passed the village plan. We had a market study done. We got a lot of professional assistance. That has not made any kind of difference. The other thing that we did, which I think is unique to the village plans that you see out there from the various villages, is that we did not restrict ourselves strictly to what would be considered the village center. We included the areas around it, the apartment complexes, the schools, because we thought that there was an opportunity to actually trade land to do different things if you needed different footprints. That has not made a difference. So I don't know what this better facilitate means, and I'm not even sure it'll be a consideration within the updated general plan. It may be something that CA needs to consider, as well as the respective villages, but I don't think it's part of this update.
Jenny's been patiently waiting. Jenny, why don't you go real quick, and then we'll go into the Don's presentation.
Ginny, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I will be real quick because I think Don's going to elaborate a lot more on, more than likely, on what I'm thinking. But Council Bill 21, passed a long time ago, is really kind of restrictive in terms of developers and communities need predictability. Council Bill 21 doesn't really always achieve that, and there's a lot of redundancy. So I've heard actually from council members that have said it needs to be amended, but this isn't quite the time. We're in the middle of an election. So, you know, we do have constraints on our ability to be creative and to get things done both in our village centers, and it really applies to our village centers. So that's something, if you keep those same constraints or you don't look at whether they're harmful, it's going to impede our progress. So predictability, I think, is important for both groups. The other thing is location, location, location. It is different for different villages. Some are lucky to be in, frankly, really better locations. And the third thing is we've got to stop thinking that every village center has to have X, Y, and Z, and really think about, as Paul said, the greater area around there, including the schools, the other apartments, other, not just literally the village center, but other business parcels, which we tried doing in Oakland Mills, but we need help to do that. We really need the government helping us and consultants helping us, quite frankly. And we need to have flexibility. I don't know, incentives isn't necessarily a bad word for developers, but predictability is crucial, absolutely crucial. And it depends on what incentives you're talking about. But we need to start doing something, and including Snowden and Dobbin all being retail, maybe there could be more flexibility on that as well. So that's it. Thanks, guys.
Okay, great. And then just a reminder, if you could mute or turn down TVs and things in the background, or mute your mic, that would be great. So Don, why don't you should be able to, Steve, if you unshare, and Don, you can share your screen. And you're on mute, Don.
Yep. I'm trying to find the right screen, which is the eternal struggle, isn't it? To try to find the right screen to share. Let me make sure I got it. Just a second. One more try. Just a second. Hang on. All right. Why is that file not up? It should be up. Here we go. All right. I want to try again. There it is. It's a mystery, isn't it? Why it works sometimes and doesn't work other times. Human error may be involved. You never know. And so, all right. I recognize some voices, and I will add my thanks to the team there for your all being part of this and caring so much. I'm going to keep this short in terms of slides. I have 7 slides, of which one is a bookend cover and one is a bookend end. And so there are only 5 slides of substance. I'm trying not to weigh in on the very difficult planning questions you have, but just because I'm not part of the team, I've been asked here for a particular purpose. You've gotten to governance, and redevelopment is tied in with governance. And so I think all of you probably know, but if you don't know, about 4 years ago, Howard County hired us to do an assessment of the zoning. It started off with inviting me to talk about what do you do about PUDs or FDPs when they get too strict. That turned into, would you be interested in bidding on an assessment of new town zoning? And that evolved into, well, why not the whole county? So we did an assessment of the whole county zoning system, and we made recommendations, and that's why I'm here. So somebody give me a thumbs up. Can you see my screen now? Yes, good. So we did this, and it covered the whole county, but a lot of attention was paid to Newtown because it is very complicated, extremely complicated for the reasons that you all know better than I do. So I think it is fair to say that at the end of that process, which took about a year, we had pretty good consensus that the assessment was a good approach for moving forward with a rewrite of the zoning in Howard County. That would involve a substantial amount of effort on Newtown zoning. But after the election, the new county executive decided they didn't want to pursue that. So it's out there. I still think it's well regarded, but it is not a project. So the real question there, and the reason I'm here is to say, okay, you have some stuff that's only 2 years old that tackles a really difficult problem. It's difficult just as planning for a future of Columbia is difficult. Transitioning from what allowed Jim Rouse to make a fantastic place to allowing a county to govern a fantastic place or to guide the evolution of Columbia is also a really complicated problem. So let's start from there. So what I want to talk about in the next 4 slides is, okay, in your left hand, you have your process going along. You're developing policies, and some of those are redevelopment, and some of them are governance. And in the other, I should have used your left hand twice. And in the right hand, we have this work that said, okay, how does that turn into a better system that would work in the future? Because you could talk these things to death. And until somebody changes or refines or evolves the planning vision and then comes up with a way to require or incent the private developers to do something different than they're doing now, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. It's just talk. And so the plan is, you're in charge of the plan. I'm happy to be here tonight. I'm going to go from there. In light of where you're going with policies, how do we connect that to the work that had been done a couple of years ago in redevelopment? So I'm going to talk about 3 of them. R1 and R2 have already been discussed tonight. And then I'll go on to governance because I really flip back and forth. How do I present this, right? R1 and this order or another word. But let's go this way. So R1 and R2 say, whoops, I'm sorry, let's go back. You just read this a little while ago. And it says to work, to be effective, we need to completely revamp the approval process and identify incentive. We've already talked about that. And I can tell there's already some head scratching as to whether that's where you want to go with this. And you also said redevelopment would be more acceptable if it incorporated key signature elements that reflect Columbia's character. To me, that's the easy part of this. There are lots of ways to work down the road and say, so what's special? What is special about these areas? Don't spend years doing it. Spend some time and identify for village centers or neighborhoods, what are the key elements? And if you've got 20, you got too many. Nobody can do 20 things. Most people can do 3 to 5 things or 7 things. But you think hard about it and you can codify those either as incentives or redevelopment. So how do we work this forward? Sorry for my phone ringing. Okay. Now, so building from the assessment and trying to finish this quickly to allow as much time for you to ask questions as possible. The assessment focused on village center zoning. 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, when we walked in the door, they said, you know what's hot here? Village center zoning and village center redevelopment. Well, here we are a couple of years later, and it's still hot and it still gets a lot of attention. And I agree, it is your community, and CA should have a significant input on the village center development. But I'll be clear, and this is just me talking because I'm just here to give you my advice. That should not be through the way it's designed now through the process, which is repeated hearings, a whole series of iterations. Well, we looked generally, and then we look more specifically, and then we look more specifically. And each one of these has a substantial amount of citizen involvement, Columbia, CA involvement, other citizen involvement. But to be very frank with you, each one adds time and unpredictability to the process. The more timely and expensive and unpredictable it is, well, Don, that'll only winnow out the cheap stuff and we'll get the best of them. Well, yeah, if you get it done. Otherwise, the best of them go bankrupt in the process. And we've seen that around the country. If you talk it to death, if you insist on being involved at every step of the review process, A, some developers will not be interested in doing it, and B, others will wear out and leave along the way. So it's a risky strategy. When I looked at that redevelopment process, we kind of scratched our heads and said, OMG, it would be very surprising if the market could work through this system. Instead, I recommend, this is just me talking, just me trying to advance your discussion. You should build on the policies that you eventually decide on to try to figure out a joint development of simpler, more objective, meaning mandatory development standards and advisory development guidelines, and perhaps development incentives. I want to stop here for a second. There's a big difference in my world of writing zoning ordinances between development standards and development guidelines. Be clear about that. It can be outside the code, but if I say it's a standard, that means whoever approves this development can deny it for not doing that. If it's a guideline, you wish they would do that, but if they choose not to do that, you're still not going to condition them or deny them over there. Guys, it's very hard to do this, but it's very clear, because the more you can distinguish between this, the more the good developers can say, well, I could do the things they're going to require me to do, and I could do some of the guidelines. But if they're all mished up, at the shoulds and the shalls are all messed up together, then a lot of people are going to say, I don't even know how this is going to come out. I'm not interested in engaging with a one-year discussion about what I have to do and what they want me to do. Then allow the county to operate this as an administrative approval system based on the standards and incentives. I have a feeling that will be an unpopular statement to make. And I make it just because that's the way zoning is going around the country. I have no clients. Our firm has worked with 223 different communities on zoning updates. I have no clients who are trying to get more involvement late in the process, which adds unpredictability and expense and time to the process. I have many clients who have said, can you get us the same or better results through good design standards, good zoning, good incentives, and an efficient process by which we move to, we don't have to look at every aspect of everything to bless it before it happens. We agree and we negotiate, and we work very hard on the deal. If they do this, that's gonna work. But you work it through ahead of time. And I'm not implying it's one thing for the village centers. It could be 10, it could be 11. But the clearer you are about what must be done, what you wish would be done, and set it up so that if somebody does those things, they get adopted, you are moving towards what I would say is the mainstream of the process. You don't have, that doesn't mean Columbia is like everywhere else. It just means that's how governance is going around the country. And the reason is A, for all the reasons I said, plus B, the more you don't go there, the more you narrow the range of developers who are willing to work with you, because they're not in the game to gamble. They're in the game to make money, and they're willing to do what you require them to do. So set the bar where you want to set it, but don't make them go to a beauty contest over and over again. So again, multiple hearings is not going to work in this area. Sorry if that hurts feelings, but no one is going in that direction. And to be honest, Columbia is a wonderful place, and you can define its character and its elements, and you can get there without requiring, well, let's send it around again at a more specific level of detail. Next, G3, which is going to come up later, and this is a transition. So here's what it says. You'll see it in a bit. Responsibility for and regulation of redevelopment guidelines in village center must be revisited and clarified in the GPU, which may require revisions to NT zoning within the overall zoning code. We think it does. I mean, our assessment said you should replace NT zoning, but I want to be very clear with all of you, with something unique to Columbia. The current NT zoning, in my opinion, is not workable, and you're paying the price for it. But you can replace it. People do this around the country. They take individualized FDPs and deals that were made, and you've got 264 deals knitted side by side, and they turn them into tailored zoning districts. And I can't tell you how many that is, and we haven't drafted them, and I haven't even given it much thought, but I've seen it work, and that's what you have to do, is to get to that point. So I want to be very clear. When we say NT zoning, our assessment said you will keep NT zoning, but it will not be what you have now. It will be more objective, it'll be tailored, and it will be in the form of districts that don't require individualized approval every time a redevelopment process comes in. It will set the rules and the standards and the guidelines, and then you will let it run until you decide to amend it. Finally, CA should be prepared to exchange the current long and iterative. We've already talked about that. So last slide of substance. The assessment documented the unworkability of this and said, to me, very simplistic, I know you've seen the assessment, here are two alternatives. You take your FDPs and you categorize them. You come up with X number of unique to Columbia zone districts that, you come up with new residential districts or mixed use districts or new non-residential districts. I just use this to kind of conceptualize it. Is it easy? No, it's really hard. We went through this, a parallel or analogous process with Albuquerque a few years ago, where they had literally 40 some different regulatory documents that were highly individualized. And you had to say, what does this mean? It can't be 40 novels that govern the development of Albuquerque. You need a playbook. You need a set of standards that people can tell, I'm in this neighborhood, so that can happen, and that can't happen. And then the other alternative was, well, instead of intended scale of character, you could do by existing use and character. We want to preserve these areas. We want to really narrow it down and say, yeah, we got an FDP and we don't want it to change very much. I could have drawn 7 of these things. There are lots of ways. And the truth is, if the county moves forward with this, or if this assessment is accepted as a foundation for fixing county zoning and particularly Newtown zoning, it won't be any one of these things. I'm not asking you to vote one way or the other. Nobody asks you to vote. It will be staring at 268 things and asking the question, what could we turn this into in terms of a zoning district that would allow more flexibility, but not too much flexibility to either take it the way we want to go or keep it from changing in the way it's changing. And the last thing is here, once again, I'll go back to the design standards and guidelines. Just as I recommend, and it's just me talking, not to try to micromanage each actual approval, which is what I think the Village Center redevelopment process does now, but also don't try to put all these key things in one document. If they're standards, they're legally binding, but they can be books outside the code itself. That makes the code much more user-friendly and understandable to the citizens of Columbia. And you still make the standards binding, but you don't have, it'll double the size or 50% higher the size of the code if you try to put it all in the code. It can be a point system. Lots of times the way you allow architectural and design flexibility is to say, it needs to hit the following bases. It needs to include this or that or the other. And then you got to include 4 out of the following 10 elements. And well, how do we know they won't choose the cheapest one? They probably will. So choose 10 elements of which when they choose the 4 of them, it's good. It's good enough. But allow them the flexibility to do it. Be clear about the character. And then again, this is not just about Village Center and downtown, and it can address, how, under what conditions, where and how do you want to do ADUs? Where and how do you want to have affordable housing distributed, as you've discussed so far? Where and how do you want very small houses to be replaceable with a little bit bigger houses or not? So I think that's enough for me. I'm trying to seed the conversation. So as you talk about governance, you're aware and the conversation is taking into account the work that's already been done, which has not been approved, except that they paid us and said, this looks like good work. And then they said, let's try to push it forward. And it didn't happen. So I would first like to offer anybody, Yuri, Steve, Tom, anybody, please correct any misstatement I have made or tell me I've stepped in a bucket so that the ensuing conversation can be guided by accurate information.
I was going to just say that I don't think there's any errors or stepped in any buckets at all. I think it's all on point. I was just going to make a note, though, in response to a comment that Paul made, that in fact, the general plan update does include looking at Columbia, does include some work on the villages and specifically the village centers as well, and some transportation work in the current work scope. So it does exclude the downtown, but it very explicitly does include what is called a framework plan for Columbia. And I showed you some weeks back what the language was, and we can revisit that if you want, but I just wanted to make sure about the scope being clear to everyone of the general plan update. It's a little off point from your comments, Don, but I just wanted to get that in.
We had a couple, several comments lined up here. And first of all, Alan, is that you that comes in as Becca Bartholomew? Or whose green name is Becca Bartholomew?
Oh, I don't think that that person has a microphone.
Oh, okay.
I wonder about Don unsharing his screen unless he thinks he might need it again.
Oh, I thought I had. I'm sorry. I apologize. Let me unshare it then. Sorry. We might need it again,
Okay,
but let's just.
Alan is here.
Thank
Okay.
you, Alan.
With that. My phone was muted because I'm on my phone on the other identity. I had three comments, but really an overall question. I mean, you know, when you said this village center redevelopment plan isn't workable, and yet we've already had one village center redeveloped and we got two more underway. You said there's a price we're paying. I'm not clear what the price we're paying is. And so I guess what I'm trying to figure out what problem we're trying to solve here at this point. That's not clear to me.
Well, I think the problem, well, and once again, let's just make it a forthright conversation. And I readily admit that it's been a couple of years. And if I have misremembered or misunderstood the issues, somebody just correct me, tell me that. I think the issue you're facing is you've got 6 or 7 of them that have not been redeveloped and that are aging. And I think the problem you're sounding is this: you could stay the course, but it would take you a long time to get the village centers redeveloped. It's taken you a long time to get the ones redeveloped that have been redeveloped. And this idea that there's kind of like, well, there'll be a day on which it's redeveloped. Well, village centers evolve. All commercial areas have to be evolving over time. But you do need some significant redeveloping. I think the problem is it's going to take you a lot of time and effort. The other problem is if I show that diagram to many high quality developers, they would say, I ain't touching it. There are too many ways in which a lot of time and money invested could turn out to be something I can't do or can't build, or in fact, I have to walk away. That's in my mind. If you're satisfied that it's going fast enough and that you're getting quality, then I think my comments may not be applicable.
Thanks.
Also, I could be misinformed, but it was my impression that the 2 village centers that are in process are taking quite a while and going through a lot of iterations, and haven't quite gotten to the finish line yet. And that a more streamlined process with clearer standards might allow those to move through more quickly, and also allow other village centers to be more attractive to developers to come in and help turn them around. Could be wrong.
And did you start to say something?
Oh, it was fine. It was just, I thought I was just going to say, I thought the next person was Renee, but Steve hadn't finished answering.
Let me add one more thing before we go off topic. I guess I'm trying to throw my mind back into what I know about the village centers in the time. I think when I was doing this work, and we drove around and toured with county staff and others to try to take a look at the issues in each one and scale and size and location and access. I also got the impression that there was some cherry picking going on. The developers were doing what they are due for a living, which is choosing the ones they thought had the best potential and working on them. And then there was concern at the county that a lot of these did not have that level of potential, and they would probably not be attracting a similar redeveloper in the near future. So there's also this kind of tiered there. Once again, I'll say it for the third time. If I'm wrong, please correct me. I got the sense they said, well, we got some development going on, but it's the best ones. We're worried about what happens as we go down the ladder.
Thank you. Renee, you had some comments.
I guess I'm just a little bit confused by all this. I feel like there's a transportation piece that is bigger than anybody's talking about. And I know there's a theory that people should work and live in Howard County, but that's not where we live. We live between Washington and Baltimore, and most of my neighbors work in either Washington or Baltimore. And until we address the real transportation of moving north-south, I don't think any of this really works. And as far as the village centers, I mean, they're owned by Kimco. I don't know what developer, I mean, Kimco's going to do the redevelopment. And yes, it's taking a long time, but that's because residents are involved. And I'm all for resident involvement. I might not like all their comments, and they may be dragging it out as they are with the process by my village. But that's what makes Columbia and a lot of areas in the United States work, is resident involvement.
I don't disagree. The question I think is worth discussing as you go down this road is that resident involvement at the front end, developing the plans and involving yourself in the zoning and the design standards and guidelines that will govern each one and make it unique and lead it to what you want it to be? Or is it in reviewing the proposals that come in from when a developer says, I can do that, I can bite at that, and then having what I want to be clear, guys, I don't represent developers. Our firm does not represent developers. I work with cities and counties. I'm not paid for by any developers. I'm trying to figure out, I love making my living trying to figure out how you get a better place and do it efficiently and transparently and predictably. So the question is that resident involvement in creating the rules and the guidelines and the vision that will, the vision and the plan and the zoning and the standards that will make it happen? Or is it in reviewing what the developers has submitted that they think meets this criteria or not? And I think it should be more of the former and less of the latter.
I want to remind us too, Renee, about our discussion at our last meeting was about transportation, and one of the themes of that, and it's written in some of our policies that we reviewed, is that transportation absolutely is essential to this total equation. I mean, it's really an integrated solution. But one of the thoughts was that if we allow some redevelopment in some of these areas, especially Gateway and some of the areas that have scale, it helps support the notion of transit within the community to link down to the regional transit system, and that those two things kind of go hand in hand. Go ahead. You're on mute. Go.
I agree that regional transportation goes hand in hand with a more localized transit system. But if we're trying to build a downtown Columbia or other densely populated areas that would look similar to some of the areas you would see in Northern Virginia, where you get off the subway at Clarington and there's all types of like downtown feel to it, we aren't going to have that here because we don't have the transportation system to make that work. And I think the thing that, I mean, I understand that everybody is looking at their village centers, trying to figure out what they're going to be, but each village, I mean, market studies of some of these villages are very clear in saying that they aren't going to support retail, and that because you weren't more proactive 10 years ago or thereabouts, that retail has moved outside of the villages. And I think we have to start doing a little bit of what you all were talking about, is really reimagining the village center as something else. Maybe it's not going to be a village center. Maybe it's going to be a college campus, or maybe it's going to be something else that a medical campus off away from the hospital. But to just look at it as retail and housing, I agree, it just doesn't work anymore.
And I think this notion of doing village focal plans, even though there have been plans done in the past, the idea of trying to re-energize that process, maybe look at them fresh and look at them with a broader definition of what a village center is. I think that's the policy we're trying to craft here.
Okay, my last comment, and then I'll leave you guys alone, is I'm concerned about getting away from Newtown zoning. I mean, our open space is protected by Newtown zoning. It stipulates that we have to have a certain percentage of open space land. And if that is transformed, how do we ensure that our open space stays protected?
Dawn?
It would be right for development.
To me, that's of the questions that have been raised in the discussion, that's the easy one. I don't think anybody wants to have that percentage or ratio changed. My answer to that would be, by the way, be careful. I want to be very clear about this distinction. I recommended to the county, they take the current Newtown, capital N, capital T zoning, and on a given day, sometime in the future, replace it, repeal it, and reenact a different form of Newtown zoning. So I want to be very clear. We actually kind of said it better be called Newtown zoning or CA, and the citizens are not going to accept it. It is unique to Columbia. But the first part of that would say, here is the NT open space district, and here is the land it covers. That's off the table. Or here is the percentage. It's here today, and the map says this is our open space. That's done. I do not want to talk for the county. I have no insight on the county. The sense I got 2 years ago is they'd really like to fix what they perceive as being major problems in allowing Columbia to evolve in acceptable ways with good developers. And to do that, but the idea of not protecting open space never came up. If you said, tell you what, to show good faith, I'm making this up, guys. I'm just making this up to push the discussion forward. You walked in the door and said, you know what, we're willing to talk about a simpler Newtown zoning. First step, you adopt a Newtown open space district and apply it to our open space so we know it's off the table. And then we're willing to talk about the rest of this stuff. Don't quote me on that. I did it for the sake of helping you. But the bottom line is every city protects open space. Every zoning district protects open space. Yours does it in a unique way, but most new codes I write say we have parks, we have trails, we have networks, we have open spaces, and we need a zone district that says that will not go away without the action of the governing body. But they could do that under Newtown zoning today. They don't, because nobody's trying to do it. Nobody has an interest in taking open space away from Columbia, but they're the governing body. They run the zoning. They could do it today if they wanted to, but you can set it up so it's just as protected under a new code as it is today.
Thank you, Don. I'm going to move on to Sherry, then Brad. Sherry, you had a question about the Newtown charrette, and maybe Ori, you could talk a little bit about this, the Newtown charrette plan for this winter.
You want me to lead off or Sherry to raise the question first?
Yeah, Sherry, what's your specific question related to that?
I just don't think most people know that this is being planned, that this is something that will be coming up. In fact, we were initially told that Newtown zoning was not going to be included in this process. But I understand from the last meeting of the Public Advisory Committee that there is a Newtown charrette that is being planned. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. The charrette does not deal with zoning. The general plan update is not geared to explicitly address zoning and zoning change in any regulatory sense. It may deal with it conceptually if there's some agreement, but it's not going to deal with it. The charrette is meant to be a design charrette. The actual language in the general plan work scope sets up what is called a Columbia Framework Plan, which is really a fairly limited effort to hit highlights, which could be highlights that, which should be and would be highlights that are mutually defined, mutually by CA, village, the county, and the team. But within that, there's a limited number of things that will happen at the charrette. There are going to be 6 focal areas identified, which have not yet been identified. And this was what the scope was set up to describe. And then there's some design work in each of those 6 areas. And Tom and his firm are intimately involved in that ultimately as well. But the truth is, as one thinks about it, there's a lot of flesh to be put on those bones, Sherry, which needs to be better defined moving forward. All of that will only happen in March, April of next year.
Okay, so if I'm understanding what you've said, this first step is a framework. So you're saying it's a re-examination of the current framework.
Yeah, but it's focused on highlights worthy of re-examination and some redesign and some rethinking. It's not comprehensive.
Okay.
It's not a full plan for Columbia. It's a partial look at important ideas with a land use and design emphasis.
Okay, so are village centers going to be part of that?
They could be. No one's defined what these 6 focal areas are. They could be. And the process for deciding which they are and how that happens has not been set up. And obviously CA and the village board representatives should have some impact and input into that. And in our policies, Steve, we've got language there which generally talks about increasing or including, as I recall, input from Columbia representation in the development of these things.
Okay, so what is, maybe it would help me if I understood, what is your goal for this charrette? How would you define the goal?
I'm happy to actually show you the language. I don't have any goal, but I'm happy to show you the language that will drive the consultant's work. But I don't want to do that because we can come back to that when Don has a hard stop at 8 o'clock. And I'm happy to come back to that after Don and the discussion on his particular areas done, because our discussion, Sherry, is a bit more about the planning, not the zoning and the nuts and bolts.
Right, and I really appreciate, Don, your being here tonight to give us an overview of how districts may be different from what new town zoning was. That was designed 50 years ago, and this is a different kind of concept. And I can see that feeding into a new framework. So I'm happy to go back to Don for more information.
Well, I don't know. That's a pretty general question. You're right. If I'm not privy to what the charrette will be, but that's exactly right. If I had to look 5 years in the future, somebody would have done additional planning that would identify particular intended characters for those village centers and residential areas that are that need to transition or that Columbia believes ought to transition. And that those would be our best guess of, we would, as if the county ever decided to go through this and said, okay, so Don, what does a new town zone district look like? We would say, okay, in this hand, we have all of the planning work that's been done in Columbia, which informs what are the key signature elements? What are the intensities? Whatever you've done to think through this future for these discrete areas, we're going to look at that. And then we're going to look at what other master plan communities, how they evolve, and kind of say, what is the menu of zone districts that would be enough to reflect these characters? I got to tell you, the number is a lot less than 264. You don't need 264 crayons to color a picture. And no offense, but you can do it with a lot less than that, and the flexibility, so that through the approval process they turn out different. Doesn't mean one size fits all, doesn't mean, oh, we're going to get the same thing as you get on the strips, but you do it, that did work up there. You would take those two things. What do we know about what Columbia Association and its citizens want these things to become? And what do we know about workable master plan community zone districts? And then we would say, so we think there need to be X, and here is the menu of X. But there is no generic menu of that stuff. You'd have to get in and say, so let's respect the planning that's been done so far and design these around what they want these places to become.
Right. Thanks, Don. I want to hit, I know we have 8 minutes left with you, so I want to hit Brad and then Jansen. Brad, you had a question about streamlined process attracting high quality development.
Yeah, the idea kind of piqued my curiosity that, if the process is well known, that the number of, it's not just that you're attracting development, it's that you might attract developers who might be more creative or more sought after, or produce a higher quality product in the end. And I'm wondering if that's, conceptually that makes sense to me. I'm wondering if that's backed up by practice.
Yes, it does. That's what I was saying. But to be very candid, I'm sure you'd find competitors of mine who would disagree with that. But that is what I was saying, and I want to be clear. Okay. To some degree, developers want to make a profit. It's a risky business. Sometimes they make a profit, sometimes they don't. The more money they spend getting through your process, the less money they have to spend on design and amenities. That's a simplistic statement, but you should be aware every time. The guy's budget doesn't expand as the process takes him longer to get through and the unpredictability expands. They have a budget. They might be able to borrow more money. They might not. But you should assume that the more time you spend talking about it, you may be paying a price in what they can do to make you happy in the end.
Yeah, of course. And so I guess the key question is, how do you capture everything you want to capture in a set of standards that doesn't end up loopholed or abused?
It's very hard. It is hard, but to be honest, guys, you're reminding me of why I liked work. I'm not getting for work, but guys, this is a very smart, engaged community, and I would worry much more if you didn't have so many smart, articulate, engaged, caring people who could figure it out. So you go through a process just like you're going through now to try to refine that. If it's wrong, then you amend it. This happens all the time. We think we got it right, but we're not getting enough of X, or they're all doing Y, which we only hoped half of them would do Y and the rest would do Z, and we'd get some variety. They're all doing Y. All right, so amend it down the road. But the hard bridge to cross is from these 264 little novels into a system that people could understand.
Makes sense to me. Thanks.
Okay, Jansen, did you want to comment? You had a comment about Hickory Ridge, and
no, I was just Mr. Elliott had noted that there were several villages that were in a long, protracted redevelopment process, and I was just noting that Hickory Ridge was one of those villages, and it's approaching 5 years, and I think it's going to be several more before there's any level of final planning, because I'm sure there'll be appeals following the zoning board process. So that was all. I was just answering his question as part of the discussion. So thank you.
All right. Let's see. Dick.
I think I got time for one more, and then I really got to go because I got another presentation.
Resident involvement that doesn't get listened to.
I'm going to pass in view of the amount of time that's left.
Okay. Bran.
Sorry, I'm fine. I was really just making comments on the discussion.
Okay.
Well, let me do this. I was flattered to be invited to do this, and I'm happy. I hope I have added value rather than made your lives harder. Obviously, it is your choice where you go with your vision. It is, to be honest, legally, mostly the county's choice as to what they want to do with this zoning. Hopefully, they will look for your advice and input along the way. But I'm hoping that the rest of this presentation and your discussion will at least be informed at what the county 2 years ago thought was a direction they wanted to go to, and how you might align your discussions with that point in time. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm happy if you ask me more questions that are follow-ups on this. I see the chat running over here. If Yuri asks me, or Steve or Tom, I'll try to answer them so they can pass the answers on to you. So.
Right. Thank you very much, Don. We appreciate you joining us tonight. Thanks. All right. Why don't we take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and start in on governance, and we can continue some discussion on redevelopment and then have discussion on governance. So I have 7:50. So why don't we just say 5 after 8? We'll rejoin.
Hey, Uri.
Hey, Tom, I sent you a message. It's Jessica, if you get a chance.
Oh, sorry, Jessica, I was on mute. Yeah, that would be great. I'll give you the floor.
No problem. I realized when, even though I sent it to you, it probably got lost in all the feed. So,
Yeah, there's quite a bit. I'm trying to.
okay, sounds great. Thank you.
All right. I'm not sure if everyone's back. It's 8:05. Jeff, before we go into Steve's, Steve continues on governance. I know there's been a lot of chat on open space, and Jessica, you wanted to make a comment about that?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I've been really enjoying reading through your guys' chat discussions about open space. And one of my first projects when you hired me was to review open space ownership and how it's being used at CA. So I just wanted to add a little food for thought as you move into your governance instruction, and because you're having so much discussion about open space, is that when we talk about creating a district for the open space areas, you can differentiate between the larger continuous open space area of connected corridor that contributes to the 36% minimum cap in the Newtown district. And you could kind of section that out and create a new district just for that. And then also discuss, there are other open space areas that you can then have standards and site design elements for as part of areas of Newtown that are residential or commercial that still contribute to the open space feel of Columbia, but don't necessarily need to be part of a specific open space district. So I just wanted to add that comment in there since I didn't know if we'd ever get a chance to talk about that in the chat. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Jessica. So Steve, do you want to go into governance right now, or do we want to continue some discussion that's in the chat here? Oh, you're on mute, Steve.
There we go. There's only like 4 top slides on governance, or 4 topics, policies. I mean, maybe, I think, Dawn gave, there was a lot of food for thought, and I think some of these topics on the governance, I think could help us move forward and have some additional discussion relative to, some of the thoughts that he threw out there. So why don't I go through these?
Right.
And then we just, we have a good bunch, we got started a little bit early tonight. So on purpose, so we'd have some time and not be really pressed for time, so we could, dig deeper into this topic and help craft some positions. So why don't I go ahead and run through these? And some of them are more relevant to Dawn's discussion than others. Hold on. Okay, here we go. Here we go.
Yes, you're good.
How's that?
Yeah, that's good.
So this is like right on, right? I mean, this is the relationship between Howard County and CA is an appropriate topic for the general plan update, and talk about a clear, resounding vote. And so clearly this whole relationship, between CA and Columbia and the general plan is something we should continue to talk about. And I think the discussion that we were just having before the break about the charrette, for instance, and there are 6 areas, and what are those areas? I mean, those to me seem ripe for CA and for you all to take a position on and say, here are the areas we think should be looked at, And I think part of the purpose of this whole exercise we're going through right now is to help provide guidance, for input into that general plan process. And so as we craft these final sort of policies, we should be thinking about how they can do that, how they can provide input to the county in terms of the position you all want to take. So anyway, the policy that comes from that question is pretty obvious, and there's clear efforts to enhance and define a collaborative role and identity for CA and Columbia in the general plan update, should be made. And I think as when we go into discussion, maybe Uri can help us clarify what that means. I mean, how do we do that? The next question had to do with Columbia plans should be explicitly not acknowledged in the general plan update. And again, a very strong, this notion of sector master plan for Columbia should be incorporated in the general plan update. In other words, this is saying that you all want to have some definitive positions defined, and to input into the general plan update, and the form that takes needs to be discussed. And then now here's where we really get into Dawn's subject matter, and design standards for redevelopment and adjacent to Columbia need to be addressed in the general plan update and beyond. And there's again, this is a little deceiving, these votes, because again, it's building up that, if you take the green, the red, and the purple, or actually in the orange, you end up with 6, 9, a predominance of votes that are going in the general direction of that there needs to be a discussion about standards. And the one that got the most vote is that, and this is exactly what Don was saying. He said, CA should be prepared to exchange the current iterative redevelopment approval process in village centers for more predictable design standards, and whose crafting CA has been directly involved. I mean, in one sentence was basically what he was, recommending.
You need to advance the slide, Steve. We're on the votes. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, so responsibility for and regulation and redevelopment guidelines and village center plans must be revisited and clarified in the general plan. But in the second bullet again, that CA should be prepared to exchange the current long and iterative redevelopment approval process for more predictable design standards. So that was what he was advocating. And then I think this is not quite the last one, next to last one, but this kind of jumps topics and gets into sort of CA itself and revenues and the fact that there's CA revenues are declining and how to kind of, and putting pressure on services. And so how to address that here and the topic. And there was a lot of ideas here. And a lot of them in conflict with each other. And so I think we should just have a discussion on that, separately. But the one that got the most votes was, reducing subsidies combined with relinquishing some services to the county, which is basically saying, let's, prune out, some of the facilities that have the most cost for the least benefit, and then see if there can be more county cost share. Seem to be, of the ones offered up, the one that got the most vote. And you can see here the policy that came out of that is four parts. A prioritized reduction in services, reducing subsidies for some facilities, relinquishing some services to the county, and then renegotiating FDP constraints on selling CA assets, which is kind of a fairly radical idea, but the idea would be that if there's some assets that could be monetized to help offset other costs, that should be considered, but there needs to be some FDP changes to do that. Also, every effort should be made to maintain and increase CA revenues by potentially growing the residential tax base. If new housing were to come in, there should be an increase in that. And again, leveraging assets and transferring financial responsibilities to Howard County. And contingency plans for constraining costs need to be prepared, including service and subsidy reductions. I mean, that's a little bit redundant, but it's basically saying, the future is unknown, so there should be some contingency planning done for that future. So there's really two topics here. One really has to do with guidelines and the topics that Don suggested, and then a separate discussion, a topic on CA revenue. So on that, I would suggest we circle back around and talk about this, these earlier components about design standards and how to input into the general plan update.
Yeah. And I know Jenny, or I'm sorry, Bryn, you had a comment, and Jenny, but Bryn, you had a comment about the upfront involvement. Did you want to elaborate on that, liking that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I was really just agreeing with the comments that Don had made about setting standards to streamline the process, and that I think we'd all be better off if our input was primarily on the front end rather than the back end. But I do think there's a level of trust that has to be established in order for that to be effective, so that if you put that effort on the front end, that you trust and believe in the process, that at the back end, it's not going to be through exceptions or waivers or other types of things the standards not adhered to.
And Jenny, you had a comment or wanted to make a comment?
Yeah, actually, I think Bren just said it very well. And I'd like to just, for some people that don't really know the Columbia Villages really well, I'd like to just explain, when we talk about KIMCO, that's 7 villages, they own them. So they can do pretty much whatever they want as long as it's approved by the zoning board. But in the case of Oakland Mills, Long Reach is owned, we have a developer that doesn't care. In the case of Longreach, the county owns it. In the case of Owen Brown, Giant owns it. So I would love to see the county look at Oakland Mills, and I don't know if Paul will agree with this, as perhaps a pilot to look at what Don Elliott is talking about in terms of predictability, standards, et cetera, and see if that couldn't be something that would attract a developer that would be innovative, creative, something that would really be looking at the future, not always talking about what was in the past. We could really be a pilot because we are kind of unusual. And we always talk about the village center like it's one owner. That's true in our case, except we also have out parcels, retail, that are owned separately, about 5 of them. So it's a kind of an interesting situation. So that's it. We're not all the same.
And Jenny, I would just add that Oakland Mills has done more work on its village center plan and more recent work than the other villages. It's more up to date and more detailed, which supports the notion of it being looked at as a pilot.
Yes, and it's also covers more areas. Paul said the schools, the apartments that mostly cover the interfaith center, et cetera.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But also CB 29, that, as I said in my chat room thing, people don't really understand that bill and how restraining it is and how much redundancy there is and how it can discourage a developer as well as residents that have to go to the same hearing by a different group and say the same thing. And, you know, we need to really look at how we can achieve what we want in terms of participation, but streamline it so that we don't discourage, like happened in Longreach, a good developer and he left. So, but Janet might want to say more about that. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I'm going to skip over. I think there was a lot of dialogue on the open space, but I think Jessica responded to that, and there was some private discussion answering that. I want to go to Alan. You had a comment about what Ori had mentioned earlier, the 6 areas that the Newtown charrette would look at.
Well, it just it just seems to me it's a form before function or something, that to know there are going to be 6 areas before one knows what the 6 areas are is to belie the fact that maybe it should turn out to be 7 or 5 or whatever. That just seems like a crazy process. So I don't know who has power over that.
Yeah, Ori, do you want to maybe explain how that's?
Yeah, this is actually a good chance to respond to Alan's point, which I don't disagree with, Alan. Actually, if you can just let me share the screen, Tom, I can show everyone what the actual current work scope says. Am I a co-host?
Or well, you have the ability to share.
I do. Oh, okay. Okay. So let me just find it here. Here we go. Yeah, here we go. So you should be seeing a screen that says what the GPU scope now includes on Columbia. Do you see that?
We do.
Okay, good. So this was, Alan and everybody, this was conjured up a year ago before anyone had any idea about the details in this process and so on. So this is fairly generic language, and in theory it could be refined, and in theory you all could have a role in refining it. So this is what it says. This is what the consultant is planning to do next year. So it says up to 6 focus areas.
That makes more sense.
Okay.
So Ori, could one of these, like 3 of these be village centers and one of them be gateway even?
Yes. There's also a transportation component that is important for you all to look at. And then when I asked the prime consultant on the county plan to give me an example and I showed you this a few weeks ago, of what a focus area, parts of it might look like. This is from another project, another plan, but here's the jurisdiction. And then here are 6 areas that were looked at in detail. And on the right hand of the screen, you can see a detailed urban design plan that's worked out. And then in more detail, different elements are described, and a vision for how it might look is presented, and so forth and so on. So that's a flavor for the level of detail for each of these 6 areas, which would fit within an overall framework. And the overall framework is not defined. And it strikes me that this is an area ripe for Steve, us maybe developing a policy around, frankly, in terms of CA and community input into its refinement as a task, or something that gives us, with the benefit of this process, the benefit, gives us a little more role, gives you all a bit more role in exactly what that means.
And those 6 are just for Columbia or for the county?
No, Columbia, that's Columbia. That's only Columbia. So Alan, I hope that helps a little in explaining what's expected.
Well, that makes more sense to say up to 6. You have to limit something. What are we going to pay for?
Right.
But to claim there will be 6.
Right. Yep.
Okay, great. I know I want to call on Nancy. I know, Nancy, you had conversation on something with Ann, but I wanted to first, before getting to you, there was some conversation about selling assets, CA assets, and that idea. There's a lot of discussion in the chat about that being off the table or not possible. Does anyone want to elaborate any further on that, or are we good with
Yes, I would like to address that. Of course, the CA is going through some problems with this pandemic, and we've had to look at our budgets, and we've had to make a lot of decisions about where our money is going to go and where it's going to come from. But this has nothing to do with zoning. And so these are internal discussions with CA on how we can serve the public. So it really doesn't belong in this discussion. And I would like to go back to the idea of governance. One of the big problems we have is most towns or counties or whatever have borders. And everything that takes place within those borders is governed by whatever the authority is. We don't have that. Columbia consists of whatever Rouse was able to buy from the farmers. And we have these out parcels. And if you're going to do a plan for an area, which I consider Columbia to be an area, it has to be inclusive. We have situations like just one right now. We have regulations about gas stations. And we have a gas station on Snowden River that follows those rules. And they have buffers set up. They have a small sign, et cetera, et cetera. Across the street, we have an out parcel where a developer has gone in and put in a 20-pump gas station, convenience store, and car wash, which totally violate our standards for what Columbia is all about. And we need to make sure that if we're going to talk about Columbia, we have an area, a physical area, where everything is compliant with the regulations. And if we continue to do this just on the basis of, what Rouse bought over 50 years ago, we have a problem. We're not going to have a comprehensive plan.
Right. Thank you, Dick. Nancy, did you want to say anything?
Am I on mute?
No, you're good.
Okay. I can undo this too. I heard what you said about Oakland Mills being the first one that they're doing this work on. I didn't understand that. I mean, Wild Lake went through a horrible several years until we finally got the approval for Kimco. Well, we didn't get it. Kimco got the approval to move forward, but it was a huge struggle. And we were hoping that this was going to be an example for at least the other Kimco properties. And sadly, as Hickory Ridge has proven, that's not the case. They now get to suffer the pain that we went through. It's a shame, but I mean, it's a tough community, and you really have to make the community happy. It's almost impossible.
All right, thank you, Nancy. Okay, we don't. I think we took care of everyone in the chat. Does anyone?
Well,
Can I ask?
And I guess there was maybe two comments that were together but they were very separate.
Okay, sorry, Alan.
Well, two other things. One is it's a small thing, and I think I know what your intent was, but you have that one suggestion that said every effort should be made to increase CA's or the tax base. I don't think every effort should be made. We've got open space, we've got affordable housing, we've got all kinds of things that lower the tax base or keep it lower than it could be. So we don't want to make every effort. We want to make reasonable efforts. So that may just be a semantic quibble, but it feels important to me if we're going to try to create standards that can then be interpreted and upheld in the future.
Okay,
I would agree with that.
I also think there's a more important, no, I'm not going to say more important, a different, but important schmirgling, as my mother used to say, of CA and Columbia in a lot of what it's almost, I'm going to use that word again, sleight of hand. It's almost like the people need to be involved, but CA needs to be involved, but then we're back to the people. And there really isn't an agreement within Columbia of what is CA's role with respect to Columbia. I mean, there are those who would see CA as the owners and managers of sports facilities. And yet there are others who would see CA as the spokespeople for Columbia's vision and values. And that's a thing that that's going to need to be resolved before we start making or at least spoken to, before we start making grand statements of just sort of lumping them together with CA/Columbia.
Ellen, can you talk a little bit more about that from the point of view of how it affects any process in which Columbia, in quotes, engages with the county on the general plan update? What's the implication of what you're saying?
Well, I think some work needs to be done if CA is going to be seen as a spokesperson, then we need to do some work so that we are positioning ourselves as that. So we are opening ourselves up to the community. And one way to look at CA is CA only equals the 10 of us. We are the board of directors, and we are the only members of CA from a legal point of view. So if we're going to act as spokespeople, we need to start a more serious process of gathering information, connecting with the people, and so on. And that's got to be a legitimate process that is seen that way by the people. Otherwise, we're just seen as another interest group, CA, and as versus a gazillion other interest groups. And then the last point I would make is I believe, I don't have the citation for it right now, but I believe we have some restrictions in our covenant, and not our covenants, but our charter, about who we can transfer our assets to, our property. It has to be other public organizations. I don't think we couldn't sell land to Ann Forsyth, for example. I don't think that's whether we wanted to or not. I believe that's true. I'm not an expert on that.
What a pity, as I love land in Columbia.
You were the first picture I saw.
Steve, you started to say something earlier too. Did you want to?
Well, I was going to be so bold as to circle back around to the door that creaked open an inch, where, could this group, could you all have a position on what 6 areas are focused on in this general plan process, areas that you feel could, that deserve some attention and some focus here. You have a, very high quality professional planning group who's at your, that is going to be looking at these areas. I mean, do you want to, as a part of this process, develop a position on what you think needs some planning efforts and thoughts?
You say areas, you mean geographic areas or thematic areas?
Like I was suggesting. I mean, are there, could you take, 2 or 3 village centers and say, okay, all right, let's take 3 very different ones that have very different characteristics and use this as a case study to help flesh out some options on how they could be repositioned. We talk about these commercial corridors, which, by the way, it was our misstatement that they're not within Columbia. That was, that was our mistake. But that, are there some commercial, Gateway or some of the other commercial corridors, could those be included? Are there others? Could you take a cluster of smaller parcels outside the villages that we keep talking about that might have some potential and say, let's use those as a case study of what could happen? And as a part of that, we've talked about what constitutes Columbianess, what are the signature elements of Columbia, and as a part of those focus planning areas, say, let's explore that. What attributes should those charrette study areas entail or incorporate to help explore this notion of a Columbia expression of redevelopment that's appropriate and consistent with community character? Or is that suggestion outlandish?
No, no, not at all. No, we should have a conversation around it. I actually wonder, as you were talking, Steve, whether it's even worth a quick survey or a poll. We've got 20 plus people with different opinions, and surfacing some ideas about quote unquote up to 6 areas is a hard thing to do. So I was just wondering if we should shoot a poll out with a quick response asked for, so that when we report back next time, Steve, with the final draft, we can incorporate that as sentiment.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that would be a good,
I see a couple of heads nodding.
Yeah.
What do you think, Anne?
Good idea.
Yep.
Could someone say, what is the relationship of this process we're just talking about to the general plan update process, if any?
Which process, Alan? You mean the 6 areas?
Areas.
It's it is part and parcel of the general plan update. It's part and parcel of it. The general plan update includes specifically a provision to allow Columbia to have input into some planning efforts. And so this is integrated. It's part of the monies being paid the consultant.
Thanks.
So along those same lines, I mean, in the questionnaire and in our candidate policy, we do support Don's suggestion that there be a relook at NT zoning to sort of rethink sort of its basic calibration and how it approaches development standards. Help us understand how that actually that idea relates to the general plan update process, or is that a completely independent?
Can just reframe it, Steve.
Well, Don's whole pitch of clarifying and streamlining the development standards.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah, how does that relate to the general plan update process, or is that a completely separate effort and discussion?
It would be a separate effort, but I'm not. It would be a separate effort, and it would be an effort that's probably parallel with the zoning code rewrite because they need to interact. But I wanted to respond to a comment that I saw Sherry make in the chat earlier, which was, how does anyone enforce it? If it's legally adopted by the county and the words say you shall do this and the other when you redevelop, that's a legal requirement. It's not in the zoning code, but it's a legal requirement. So there's no problem with enforcement. What you want the general plan to do, though, is to reinforce and build in the notion that design standards and guidelines, mandatory and advisory, are going to be part of the zoning rewrite and are going to be specifically applicable to the county as a whole and or to Columbia, with provisions that ensure predictability, and maybe the general plan gives some examples of it. But you want enough language in the general plan that sets it up and makes everyone sure that once the plan's adopted, this will be one of the important next steps.
I guess the other, what I wanted to ask about is, I know that there have been agreements, for example, for projects that have been approved by DPZ after public input and this very involved process that we have. And then developers will go ahead, and in the process, for example, things happen that do not follow the agreement.
Which agreement? Which agreement?
That were in the final development plan. Things were supposed to look a certain way, and they end up not looking that way for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And so the question of enforcement, I guess that was, getting it. I understand that when it becomes, there's a difference between a regulation and a guideline. And much of what our communities have been involved in have been advisory and have been guidelines. And that speaks to this issue of trust, where people have put in an enormous amount of time going to meetings, participating in these planning processes. I know in our village, it took well over a year. We had more than a dozen people involved. And then things sort of get shelved, and or a project moves forward, but ends up not looking or developing in the way it seemed to. And there doesn't seem to be any feedback or any response. So how do other communities deal with that?
Well, I can't respond to the specifics because I'm not sure of the cases and who struck John and what happened in particular case of enforcement. But let me just step back and make the point, as Jenny well knows, that Council Bill 29 gave the village plans no authority. They are purely advisory. And it's a very weird limbo status that is really not a good mode to be in. So you put all this work in, and what the council bill says is when a developer comes along with a major redevelopment, the community has to have a quote unquote community response. Okay. And then it's purely advisory. The county literally and legally can choose to ignore it. It's not binding on anyone. It's a problem with the way it was conceived. And I would say that as part of all of this renegotiation with the new town and design standards, and frankly looking at covenants afresh as well, because the covenants can be at odds with some design standards. You need to resolve that. All of the role and meaning of village plans and how they're constructed needs to be rethought because they're not effectively influential. And so you can't blame the county for ignoring them. They don't have to respect them.
So if I could add in here, Uri has suggested earlier in this process, this village center focal plan process. And if I were to use Irvine as an example of another community that has struggled with the same issue, because the Irvine is part of the city of Irvine. The Irvine Ranch is the master plan community is part of the city of Irvine. And there's somewhat the same relationship in a way. The city, like you have the county, is actually the governing agency. But what the community does, or the master developer does in this case, is they do specific plans. And I would say a specific plan in Irvine is similar to a focal plan that has been suggested here. And the specific plan is a legally binding document. It's developed by a party or third party that controls the property. It's a little bit different because you have multiple landowners here, but that specific plan then becomes a study that does have sort of legal standing in the decision-making process of the larger governing agency. And I'm just wondering if Uri, your discussion of the village center focal plans, are you thinking along the same way, that those would be, for instance, in the general plan update, there would be an acceptance or a designation of the focal village center focal area plan as a more legally binding planning document that could be developed for a village center?
Could be, absolutely. I don't know whether it's realistic to assume that in this general plan update, there'll be the time and resources, frankly, to build in X number of village center plans. I mean,
and just to clarify, you're not doing those plans now.
Okay, just a commitment.
You're just creating the framework, the legal framework.
Yeah,
for them.
There could be language in the general plan that states that. The language is advisory, it's guidance, right? General plans haven't the same legal status as they have in California. But absolutely, you'd want, I think, we all would want that kind of a commitment to be made in the general plan. That sets up for a better process.
I'd like to thank you both very much, because I think that helps us to understand, when we know what other communities have done, other master plan communities, that helps us see a little broader what some options might be and how to modify or adapt to what we have here in the county. So thank you for mentioning that.
And I would add, Sherry, that most general plans in central Maryland include by reference sector plans that are legally binding and have gone through a big community process as part of their adoption. Howard County, frankly, is the exception in not incorporating that idea into its general plan. And with 320,000 people, it may be time for them to think about the 5 areas that they've defined in their previous general plan, the 5 areas of which Columbia in its entirety, including out parcels, Dick, is one of the committed early targets for a proper sector plan.
Can I just jump in here? One of the things that CA needs is standing. We need to have a right to be involved in the process. And when we look at the people who do influence what goes on in Columbia, we've got DPZ, we've got the county council. I have a lot more confidence in Jessica and Kristen than I do in DPZ. The thing about Columbia is we are community oriented. We are here talking about the community. And as Rouse put it, this was a place where people could grow. And that's our focus, on people and not on, and the other side of the developers help us get there when they, follow the rules. And we need the rules and we need standing. So another thing about CA is none of us take campaign contributions. We get elected by our villages and we have no outside obligations or influences. We're trying to do what's right for our constituents. And so I think we have a definite role to play. And as I said before, I think it has to be over a specific territory so that you can't be forced to follow the rules if you're in one of Rouse's farms as opposed to if you're across the street. And again, I want to bring up this fees in lieu thing, because that just really frosts me. It's not a question of it having shortcomings. You know, shortcomings are reality. It's a device that's being used again and again to send the problem someplace else, and that's another thing we just have to.
Dick, an example of that, please.
If you want to have full spectrum housing, which is what we want, we, as Rouse put it, we want the janitor living in the same neighborhood as the CEO. We don't want areas that are on the other side of the tracks. We don't want areas of blight. We want a nice, seamless community. And if you have developers who go in and put in a stretch of McMansions and say, oh, I'll pay a little money so you can put the poor people someplace else, that's not Columbia.
Actually, you can get this data, whoever asked that question, you can actually get this data from the Housing Commission Task Force that's studying it now. They'll show how much of the development was on the west side, like Maple Lawn, for example, and they didn't have to do the MIHU's, moderate income housing. Instead, they paid into a fund. And then you have areas like Oakland Mills, where then the housing authority brought a market rate housing complex, and they now own it. So there are many, many examples. The data is actually there. The studies are there. It's produced for the housing task force that's in operation now. So if you really want to look at that, the specifics are in existence finally.
Great, thank you. We have about 9 minutes left. Probably want to talk about some next steps. And I think as
I have a question about, and it relates to next steps, and that is, so we've been going through this process. You know, this is our 6th meeting, and we will be getting out to you at least our perception of of sort of summary policies, and you know, some of them might not align exactly with your specific point of view. But we are being informed by the survey we did, and sort of using that as our light to help define these policies. But I think this is a question maybe for Kristen and Jessica and Uri, and that is, so we're going to have this framework policy document that comes out the back end of this process. We have this general plan update process. One of the reasons we're going through this is to inform the general plan update process. And I have a question about linkage. And that is, you know, so we have this document. How is it actually used? How can it be used to inform the general plan update process? And do we need to, and I guess that's, I'm asking that rhetorically, and then actually offering up a thought. And that is, as part of our, whether it's an appendix or whether it's a separate piece section of our final document, should we have a series of very focused policies or inputs that this effort is trying to make into the general plan update process?
So I'm not sure, Steve, that I understand
does the summary document we're creating here on its own sufficient to influence the general plan update, or do we need to have a separate set of more focused recommendations to the county representing the CA's point of view on the general plan?
I don't know how you get from where we are now. We'd be out of the picture. I don't know how you'd get to a more series of focused recommendations. That's another process and a lot of discussion. I think that a lot of the policies are fairly concrete, and their creation, delivery, and publicity around them will have an impact on the county's process. There's no question. I mean, they're soliciting input. This is substantial, thought through input, and it'll have an impact. my question goes to the broader ongoing effort when this product and our role is done. Before you get to this framework plan next March, the county is going to go through a scenario building and testing process. That's going to happen in February, March, and April, in which they will say, well, let's look at different ways in which the county and parts of it can develop. I would say, Steve, that the interim step for CA, Kristen, and Jessica to remain involved in is in looking at how these policies would inform scenarios that you want the county to test around Columbia.
Ori, I think this is something that we can talk about outside of the visioning session. This is really something for the consultants and us to coordinate.
Okay, I get it. I was trying to respond to Steve's question about continuity. But I think it's delivery and the publicity around it, and then of course, you know, ongoing involvement in a structured way in the process by CA and staff is part of it. I have a heretical question that is sparked from Alan's point about the potential divergence between the community and the leadership group. What about taking these 30 policy statements and floating them out there in a digital mode to the community at large and trying to get a random reaction or a vote in response to these specific 30 policy statements to see how close you are or how off you are with the broader community in terms of your perception of priorities?
I like the idea of bringing the community in. We have made some comments on the policies from this group, which I think were relevant. I would suggest that you try to incorporate those thoughts in, and then we send it out to the community. And definitely, let's get some feedback. Let's find out what they want.
We've incorporated your comments, and Steve has another iteration that's gone out of all previous.
Kind of go through the next steps in our process.
Okay. But Dick, let me just understand what you're saying. So when you get a final version of these policies, you're saying you all would be supportive of somehow getting some feedback from the community at large. Is that what you're saying?
This is all about the community.
Okay, yeah, fine, okay.
And yeah,
okay.
I want to get the community's input, and let's give it our best shot and see if we've missed anything.
Okay.
So kind of building on what Ori was trying to say. So we've already taken, or Steve has already taken and worked with the team on from the workshop number 5 policies, and have updated them based on the discussion we had at the last workshop. And for each of them incorporated it was a really good comment the last time about having a meta policy, and we're calling it a vision statement. So those have been refined. We're going to take this discussion from tonight and do the same for tonight's policy discussions, put them all together in a Word document that Steve mentioned earlier. We're going to be getting them, we're going to do some back and forth with Kristen and Jessica to make sure we have them right. And then we'll get them back to CA for distribution to you all, perhaps on the 11th. With the request that they're returned back to Kristen by the 16th of November. So we're giving you a heads up. We're going to give you, there's a weekend turnaround time in there, because I know that was something important to, when you have some homework, to be able to have some weekend time. And then we'll incorporate those refinements and incorporate them by before Thanksgiving. And then our next workshop, which is on December 3rd. So we'll be, so key dates for you would be November 11th. We'll distribute that out. That's the target goal, with a request to get them back by November 16th. And Kristen will be sending that out to you, and it will be in a Word document, so it'll be easy to edit and comment on.
Tom, you may or may not have said this, but we may also choose to survey you all quickly with your 6 candidate areas.
Yeah, there's been several suggestions in the chat, so we'll use them to inform a survey.
Right.
That will be a quick little poll, which would be helpful to have.
Yep.
And then with that, I think that's everything. So thank you all again for your time. This was a longer meeting tonight, but I think it was great to have Don Elliott participate. So we will officially end the meeting. And then I guess the team will stay on for a couple minutes